There was a moment in history when food stopped being food. Not all at once, not with announcements or press releases. It happened in the aisles, in the kitchens, in the recipes passed down and then quietly rewritten. One day, bread rose because yeast fed on flour and thyme. The next day, it rose because of chemicals designed in labs to mimic what used to happen naturally. And no one said anything, not really. If you were born after 1985, you've likely never tasted what your grandparents called normal, what they ate without thinking, what their bodies expected. This isn't about health trends or diet culture. This is about substitution, about the removal of something essential and the insertion of something engineered to feel the same. This is about the moment food became a product instead of a thing that grew. And it happened so quietly that most people didn't notice until their bodies did. For most of human history, food was limited by season, by geography, by what could be grown or raised nearby. Bread was flour, water, salt, and thyme. Milk came from animals. Butter was cream that had been shaken until it split. Meat was muscle. Fruit appeared once a year and then disappeared. There was no such thing as shelf-stable cream or tomatoes in December, or chicken that cost less than vegetables. Food was expensive, labor-intensive, and it didn't last. That was the trade-off, freshness for fragility. And then something changed, gradually at first, then all at once. After World War II, the factories that had produced rations and chemical supplies for the military needed a new customer base. The infrastructure was already there, the supply chains, the laboratories. So food became the next frontier. Not to feed people better, but to feed them more efficiently, more profitably, in ways that could scale. By the 1960s, the Western diet was being fundamentally rewritten. Ingredients that had existed for centuries were phased out. New ones appeared with names no one could pronounce. Hydrogenated oils, high fructose corn syrup, monosodium glutamate, isolated soy protein, carrageenan, cellulose, citric acid not from citrus, vanillin without vanilla. At first, these were additions, improvements they were called, ways to make food last longer, taste stronger, cost less. But then the additions became replacements. Real sugar swapped for corn derivatives, butter replaced with margarine, fruit juice cut with concentrates and fillers, meat extended with soy and texturizers. And it wasn't just processed snacks. It was bread, milk, yogurt, cheese, pasta, soup. Ingredients people had trusted for generations suddenly had paragraphs of fine print on the back. But the front of the package still looked the same. A loaf of bread was still called bread. Cheese was still called cheese. Orange juice still had a picture of an orange on the carton. So people bought it. They trusted it. They fed it to their children. Real food is complicated. It spoils. It varies. It requires land, labor, time, and care. Industrial food is none of those things. It's predictable. It's cheap to produce at scale. It ships well, and most importantly, it's profitable. But you can't just remove the original and expect no one to notice. People remember what things are supposed to taste like. So the solution wasn't to replace food entirely. It was to mimic it so well that the difference became invisible. Take butter. For thousands of years, butter was a simple thing. Cream, churned. Fat separated from liquid. It was yellow because cows ate grass, and the beta-carotene came through in the milk. It melted at body temperature. It tasted rich because it was rich. In fat, in vitamins, in the biological complexity of an animal that ate living plants. Then came margarine. Invented in the 1860s as a cheap substitute for military rations, it eventually became marketed as the modern choice. Healthier, they said, lower in cholesterol, better for your heart. What they didn't say, not clearly, was that it was made from industrial seed oils, cottonseed, soybean, corn. Oils that had to be chemically extracted, deodorized, bleached, and hydrogenated to become solid at room temperature. It looked like butter, it spread like butter, advertisements showed families smiling over toast. But it wasn't butter. It was a lab-designed fat made shelf-stable by breaking and rearranging the molecular structure of the oil itself. The process created trans fats, synthetic fats that the human body had never encountered before in food. For decades, margarine was recommended over butter by doctors, by nutritionists, by government dietary guidelines. It wasn't until the 2000s that trans fats were quietly acknowledged as harmful and phased out of most products, not because they were discovered to be dangerous, because they had always been dangerous. But the substitution had already happened. An entire generation had grown up eating plastic fat instead of real fat, and they'd been told it was progress. Or bread. For thousands of years, bread was made with flour milled from whole grains: wheat, rye, barley. The grain was ground and used quickly because once the oils in the grain were exposed to air, they began to spoil. That was fine. Bread was local. It was baked often. It didn't need to last a month. But industrial bread required a longer shelf life. It needed to survive shipping, stocking, sitting in warehouses. So the flour was stripped. The bran, the germ, the parts of the grain with the most nutrients and the most fat were removed. What was left was pure white starch, light, shelf-stable, and nutritionally empty. To make up for the loss, vitamins were added back in, synthetic versions of what had been stripped away. Thiamine, riboflavin, folic acid. The labels said enriched, but enriched just meant that something had been taken first. And then, to keep the bread soft, to make it rise faster, to give it texture without time, chemicals were added. Dough conditioners, preservatives, emulsifiers. The ingredient list grew to 15-20 items, but it was still called bread, still looked like bread, still sat in the same place on the shelf. People didn't question it. Why would they? It was bread. But their bodies knew something had changed. By the 1980s, wheat allergies and gluten sensitivities were rising. Not because gluten itself was new, but because the wheat was different. It had been hybridized for higher yields, sprayed with pesticides, processed with chemicals. And the bread it made was no longer the slow fermented loaves that had fed civilizations for millennia. It was fast, cheap, and fundamentally altered. Milk followed the same pattern. Once, milk came from a cow. It was raw, full-fat, unpasteurized. It varied depending on the season, the breed, what the cow ate. In spring, when cows grazed on fresh grass, the milk was richer in vitamins. In winter, it was thinner. That was normal. Then came industrialization. Dairy farms scaled up. Cows were kept indoors year-round, fed grain instead of grass. Milk was pooled from thousands of animals, pasteurized at high heat, homogenized so the cream wouldn't separate. It became uniform, predictable, but also stripped of much of its original complexity. The enzymes that helped digest it, the beneficial bacteria, the fat-soluble vitamins that required fat to be absorbed, which were reduced when they started selling low-fat and skim versions. And then came the additives. Vitamin D was added back because the fat that carried it had been removed. Emulsifiers kept it smooth. Stabilizers kept it from separating. The milk looked the same, poured the same, but it wasn't the same. Even orange juice, a product that seems straightforward, was redesigned. Industrial orange juice is not freshly squeezed and bottled. It's made from concentrate. The juice is extracted, stripped of oxygen to keep it from spoiling, and stored in massive tanks for up to a year. When oxygen is removed, so is flavor, so flavor packs are added back in. Chemical compounds designed by the same fragrance companies that make perfumes. They're derived from orange byproducts, so they're labeled as natural flavor. But the juice doesn't taste like fresh oranges. It tastes like a company's version of what oranges should taste like. This wasn't accidental. It was a system. A controlled replacement of one supersupply with another. And it was so gradual that by the time people realized something was different, they couldn't remember what it had been before. The human body is conservative. It expects food to be what food has always been. Fats that come from animals and plants, proteins that come from muscle and seeds, sugars that come from fruit, honey, roots. It has systems in place to digest these things. Enzymes, bacteria, receptors in the gut that communicate with the brain. But when the food changes, the body doesn't get a manual. It doesn't update. It just tries to process what's put in front of it, assuming it's safe, assuming it's real. For a while, it works. The body is resilient. It adapts. But over time, the substitutions begin to show. Trans fats didn't just raise cholesterol, they interfered with cell membranes, made them rigid, less able to absorb nutrients, less able to communicate. They accumulated in the body because the body didn't know how to break them down. They weren't food. They were industrial byproducts shaped to look like food. High fructose corn syrup didn't just add sweetness, it bypassed the normal satiety signals that sugar triggered. It was metabolized differently, faster, in ways that stressed the liver, in ways that disrupted insulin. It was in everything: bread, ketchup, yogurt, salad dressing. Not because those foods needed to be sweet, but because it was cheap and it made people crave more. Processed bread didn't just lack nutrition, it spiked blood sugar faster than table sugar. It contained gluten that had been altered by decades of selective breeding, proteins that were harder to digest. It contained residues from the pesticides sprayed on the wheat. And because it was so cheap and so available, it became the foundation of the Western diet: breakfast, lunch, snacks, dinner. Within 2 generations, the rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, autoimmune disorders, and digestive issues exploded. Not uniformly, not all at once, but steadily, predictably. And the response wasn't to question what had changed in the food supply. It was to blame the people eating it. You're eating too much. You're not exercising enough. You lack discipline. Try this diet. Cut carbs, cut fat, cut calories. But no one said the food itself has been redesigned. Because saying that would mean admitting that the system had failed, that the efficiency and the profit margins had come at a biological cost, that an entire population had been quietly enrolled in an experiment they hadn't consented to. And the consequences weren't just physical. Food is culture, it's memory, it's connection. When food becomes industrialized, it stops varying by region. It stops tasting like the soil or the season. A tomato in January tastes like a tomato in July, even though that should be impossible. Bread tastes the same in California as it does in Maine, even though the wheat and the water and the air are different. People stopped cooking, not because they were lazy, but because cooking had stopped making sense. Why make soup from scratch when the canned version was faster and tasted the same? Why bake bread when the store version was cheaper and lasted longer? Slowly, the skills disappeared, the knowledge of how to prepare real food, how to recognize it, how to trust it. By the time the substitution was complete, there was no comparison left. The original had been erased. There's a word in agriculture: monoculture. It means planting one crop in one place over and over. It's efficient, predictable, easy to manage. But it's also fragile. If the soil depletes, if a pest adapts, if the weather shifts, the whole system collapses. Because there's no diversity, no resilience, no backup. That's what happened to food. It became a monoculture, not of crops, but of ingredients. Corn syrup, soybean oil, wheat flour, processed and recombined into 1,000 different shapes, but underneath, it was all the same handful of commodities, subsidized, scaled, sold. And it was never supposed to be questioned. It was progress. It was modern. It was what everyone ate. But the body kept score. Some people felt it early: allergies, inflammation, weight that wouldn't come off no matter what they tried. Others didn't feel it until later: a diagnosis, a prescription, a quiet warning from a doctor who didn't mention food because food wasn't part of the medical training. And a few people began to ask questions. What changed? What's different? Why does bread from a bakery feel fine, but bread from the grocery store doesn't? Why does butter from grass-fed cows taste different? Why does food from 50 years ago look so different in old photographs? Slowly, the answers started surfacing. Not from institutions, not from the agencies that had approved the replacements in the first place, but from individuals who went looking, who read old recipes, who found farmers still growing food the slow way, who realized that what they'd been calling food for their entire lives was something else entirely. This isn't the end of the story. It's not even the most important chapter, because food is just one system. And if this could happen quietly over decades, with the full support of science and government and industry, what else was redesigned while no one was paying attention? There are other substitutions, ones we're still eating.